All right, hello everyone, and welcome back to our virtual finance seminars in corporate finance and investments. My name is Andrei Bodnaruk. I'm from the University of Illinois, Chicago, and today I'm joined with my co-organizer from the Michigan State University, Nuri Arshahin. We are very glad to have Gonzalo Maturana from Emory University today to present his fresh from the oven working paper, Do Property Rehabs Affect Neighboring Property Prices? His co-author. Uh, okay. Let me see, because I think we have, for whatever reason, uh, um, Rohan Ganduri is going to be answering some of the questions in the chat. As a reminder, let me tell you that you're going to be all muted, and we're not going to see your faces on the video. If you have any questions, please type them in chat, and one of the moderators is going to read these questions to Gonzalo in the due time. With that, again, let me pass the microphone and the screen to Gonzalo. Thank you very much for joining us today, Gonzalo. We appreciate it, and the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much for having us, first of all. Yeah, like you mentioned, this is new research. First time I'm presenting this paper, so I'm looking forward to the comments. So yes, this is joint work with my colleague at Emory, Rohan Ganduri. And essentially what we're going to be trying to answer today is stated in the title of the presentation, right? Do property rehabilitations affect neighboring property prices, okay? And the starting point is that there's convincing evidence at this point that foreclosed properties generate negative externalities to prices of neighboring properties. So what are the concerns with foreclosures is that first they lower house prices more generally, they incentivize more defaults, right? If neighborhoods start becoming distressed, right, that increases crime, deteriorates the health of people, right? So the fact that you have these foreclosures, right, that cause these houses either to be poorly maintained and be vandalized, or maybe be forced to sell very quickly, right, generate these spillover effects that ultimately policymakers and academics have long worry about, right? And this was a major issue during the past financial crisis, right? And many policy responses came as a result of that, trying to mitigate this damage from foreclosures, right, and stabilize neighborhoods more generally, right? So there's a big picture in, for example, mortgage modifications, right, trying to tackle this very same question, right? We're going to be focusing on the rehabilitation of houses today, where you find significantly less research. Okay, so one of the ways in which local governments and the federal government have incentivized, have tried to fight this damage generated by foreclosures is by rehabilitating or subsidizing the rehabilitation of foreclosed properties. Okay, so the idea here is twofold. First, you can improve the quality of the house, but most importantly, the hope is that that's going to generate a spillover effect towards the neighboring houses, right, which would basically offset this damage from foreclosures. And one prominent example of these policies is this neighborhood stabilization program, which was passed after the financial crisis, right? So $6.9 billion were allocated to rehabilitate, that is, fix and or improve, right, homes that were in distressed neighborhoods and facing foreclosures and losses in value. Okay, so essentially what we're going to be doing these papers, trying to focus on the second part of the fact, right, the part on whether property rehabilitations indeed generate positive price spillover effects to neighboring properties. Okay, so that's the objective of the paper. So this is what I just mentioned, but to formalize it, so the idea behind property rehabilitations is to mitigate the damage to the foreclosed property. That's first, and that's very mechanical, right? Once I fix a house, right, it's gonna look better and it's going to increase in price. But the real question is whether that improvement has externalities more generally in the sense of stabilizing neighborhoods. So first, stabilizing the house price drops that you might be experiencing in those neighborhoods, and second, whether there's any other improvements, right, to the neighborhood more generally. Okay, now, like I said before, a lot of the focus during the post-financial crisis was in loan modifications, likely because of the risk, right, and lower cost, right? But less attention has been placed into these rehabilitations, and in fact, there's very little research done evaluating this NSP program or anything related, um, and um, and so we think that we fit, there's a space in the literature for our paper, especially because all this research actually has failed to find an association between between rehabilitations and positive externalities in the housing market. Now, to be fair to these evaluations, they have been focusing on slightly different questions. So most of the focus of these few papers have been on the impact of spending on property rehabilitations over broader geographies, such as census tracts. So they were more concerned on whether the funds were being used and whether market participants were adopting these policies. Okay, so, and the second thing is that most of the focus has been at the census tract level, and I'm going to show you in this paper that just like you see with foreclosures, these price spillovers operate at very local effects. So we're talking distances like within 2 blocks. Okay, so less than 0.1 mile. So so for that you need essentially granular data and focus on shorter distances. So the empirical challenge here is twofold, right? So if there's any potential property rehabilitation effect, it's likely to be very local, right? So just operate within a block or two, maybe a little bit less, but definitely much larger, much smaller than a census tract. And the second thing is that properties for rehabilitation are not chosen randomly, right? So you might be concerned that maybe houses for rehabilitation are picked in those neighborhoods where house prices are rebounding, right, and starting to increase. So in the end, being able to account for very local house price trends with empirical methodology becomes key. And that's what I'm going to be arguing, that we actually have a methodology that allows you to account for these issues. Okay, so what we're going to do is we exploit a novel data set of property rehabilitations that we got from a nonprofit, and we're going to combine this data with a non-parametric method that allows to account for these very local house price trends, right? This is a method recently developed by Diamond and McQuaid, and it was published in 2009 at the JP, okay?
Okay, Gonzalo, here's one question that I think needs to be asked right here. So
Okay.
if foreclosures hurt, shouldn't we expect that rehab helps? And is there a reason to expect asymmetry? Are there different magnitudes of the effects?
So the effect is not strictly symmetrical, because when you think about foreclosures, there's two main effects. So first you have the disamenity effect, the fact that house that houses that are in foreclosure process tend to be poorly maintained. So let's say servicers forget to maintain them, homeowners, because before they get evicted, right, they don't spend money on the house, right? So the house deteriorates in quality more generally, right? So you have first that disamenity effect, the fact that the house becomes worse, right, can permeate into the rest of the neighborhood. The other thing is that those foreclosed properties tend to get sold very quickly, right? So you have fire sales in those neighborhoods, and you have some price impact just because of the sale. And roughly, if I remember the numbers correctly in the literature, 60% of that effect, of the foreclosure spillover effect, actually comes from the fire sale component, and 40% comes from the disamenity effect. Okay, so you would think that, so we find actually a result that is pretty much consistent with this 40% disamenity effect. So once you adjust for certain differences among the settings I'm going to show you, you find roughly similar effects on foreclosures and rehabs on that dimension. Now, we're going to do a lot of cross-sectional analysis and trying to pin down the channel to try to understand what is actually driving this rehabilitation effect. Okay. I don't know if that answers the question.
Okay, here's the second question then.
Mhm.
Wouldn't preventing foreclosures in the first place be a more effective policy than subsidizing rehabilitation? Any cost comparison you can provide?
Yeah, so we don't compare with that. Yeah, you can make the argument that preventing foreclosure through a modification, right, of the long terms might be more efficient, right? Like now, you have situations in which houses are abandoned and neglected for different reasons. Maybe there's when you should focus on rehabilitation. Now, you might think of rehabilitations having effects beyond just preventing a foreclosure, in the sense that once you make the house nicer, right, you might also attract maybe new buyers that are more desirable, right, and that might create some reallocation of the population in the area. Now, we don't actually take a stance in terms of the comparison. So by no means I'm saying that, okay, you should use this compared to modifications. Modifications, you can definitely scale them, right, way more than a rehabilitation, right? But this is one policy. I think people in economics worry about these spillover effects, right? So we have been studying spillover effects of neighborhoods, not only for foreclosures, but for pollution, right? Crime, right? And different variables. Like now, most of the research focuses on negative externalities, right? This paper is unique in the sense that it's one of the few that focuses in positive externalities, right? Which are not necessarily going to be, like, effects not necessarily need to be symmetrical. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So let me, before I go into the details, let me give you a summary of the results. So we find that property rehabilitations indeed have a positive price spillover effects on neighboring property prices. Now the effects, right, are in the order between 2.3 and 4%. So prices around, that is, distances within 0.1 miles of the rehabilitation property, tend to increase between 2.3 to 4 percentage points following the rehabilitation. Now, one of the methods that we're going to apply, and it's nice in the sense that allows you to estimate the household's marginal willingness to pay to live within 0.1 miles from the rehabilitated property, and we find that that's around $4,000. Now, we also document that the positive price spillover effect is larger the closer the neighboring property is to the rehabilitated property. So you have an effect, it's much stronger, very close, right, to the rehabilitated property, still pretty strong, 0.1 miles away, but then starts fading away very quickly, right, to the point that once you're half a mile away, you don't find any effect. And even before that, you find essentially zero effect, or at least not something that you can distinguish significantly. Now, in terms of the cross section, right, we find that rehabilitation externalities are stronger for longer rehabilitations. So those that take longer to be completed, they're stronger for greater rehabilitation investments. Now, interestingly, the length of the rehabilitation and the amount invested doesn't highly correlate. The correlation between those is 0.2, right? So, which means that these two dimensions capture different aspects of the rehabilitation. And one interesting result that I'm going to show you is that the results of the rehabilitation, actually their effects, are stronger for areas where you have low foreclosure rates, but they're even positive in those areas with high foreclosure rates, which basically means that indeed these rehabilitations seem like a very reasonable way of thinking about stabilizing house prices in distressed neighborhoods. And finally, we're going to show you some evidence in terms of the channel underlying the results. And most of the evidence that we have found so far points towards saliency of the salience of the rehabilitation being the main driver, right? So that's a work in progress. I'm going to show you what we have, but definitely we need to do more in that dimension. Okay. So in terms of the data, so the data on rehabilitations comes from the National Community Stabilization Trust. This is a nonprofit that facilitates the transfer and the fixing of distressed properties. Okay, so you have these eligible local housing providers, which tend to be other nonprofits, right, that can take a first look to the REO inventory of financial institutions. So you have a bank, after the foreclosure, the house enters their REO inventory, right? They would like to get rid of the house as fast as they can. Well, they provide these housing providers with the opportunity of having a first look, so being the first ones analyzing whether they want to purchase these properties or not, right? And then these buyers come in and are able to offer to get the house, right? And they typically get it at a discount. So ultimately, this program benefits the buyers, right? Because they acquire the house to be rehabilitated at a discount, which typically is something around 10 to 14% of the fair market value of the property. And on the other hand, the financial institution is not in the business of selling houses, right? So has the benefit that basically gets rid of the house from the REO inventory quickly. Okay, so that's where the main data set is coming from. So NCST gives us this transaction file that contains detailed information on the property transactions for rehabilitations between 2008 to 2017. Examples of variables included in the data set are the transaction date, the transaction price. We have the rehabilitation start and end dates, rehabilitation costs. We have full property addresses with geocodes. We have access to documents that show the work orders, right, of the improvements made in the house. And we have been working with those recently to try to get at these channels, right? So the data is pretty rich and something that at least I've never seen before this. Now, to basically capture price changes of neighboring properties, right? Neighboring properties to these houses that are being rehabilitated, we use Zillow. So we use Zillow's CTRAX assessor and transaction files. Right, so this is data that mostly comes from county assessors, right? Servicer tapes, right? And they complement it from different sources, but what it provides you is property characteristics, sales prices, transaction dates, right? You also have some mortgage information, right, in this data. Okay, so this is an example of a rehabilitation. So as you can see, the house was in pretty bad shape. Now, the fair market value of the house was estimated to be close to $40,000, right? Now, Freymac was the seller, right? And there was this nonprofit that acquired the house actually for a little bit less than $31,000, right? So like a significant discount. Now then they invested $53,000 in improving the house, right? And you can see how the pictures before and after compare. And basically what they did is they did a new deck, they changed the garage door, they did some driveway repairs, updated the kitchen, bathrooms, floors, new doors. Importantly, we can actually see what they did, right? We have the work orders for each one of the almost 7,000 or for most of the rehabilitations that we have in our data set. So those were the changes, right? And those totaled for $53,000. Now the rehabilitation took a little bit over 2 months, right? So 71 days. And then the property was resold for $153,000, right? To a home buyer whose income was lower than 80% of the area median income. Okay, area here is an MSA. It's a broad area, but this is one measure that these programs typically use in order to try to benefit low-income buyers. Okay.
Okay, Gonzalo, here's a question. So you mentioned that these properties for rehabilitation are not picked randomly. Can you speak about the geographic clustering of these properties? Do we see that there are some properties basically adjacent to each other which are developed simultaneously, or?
Okay, yeah. So we don't have, we have about 7 rehabilitations in the sample. So it's not that they're occurring at the same time. Actually, they tend to occur, even if they occur in similar areas, they occur 1 year apart or so. We don't have them being clustered. Now, what you mentioned about the randomness is important in the sense that they're indeed occurring in the areas that have the most distress, right? So there's something about this house, about these areas that are being targeted by the nonprofits. Now I'm also going to show you that these houses, the houses around the the rehabilitated property, actually tend to be a little bit cheaper than those 0.33 miles away, right? So even we're talking about 5-6 blocks away, house prices tend to be a little higher, right? Now that's consistent with also the foreclosure discount and what we were discussing before, but definitely that's something to worry about. Our methodology arguably accounts very well for those issues, and I'm going to show you what I mean by that when I get to the empirics. But let me now show you actually, your question was spot on, because that's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to show you how these areas where the rehabilitations are happening, how they compare to the rest of the country. Okay?
Just
So,
before you show
yeah.
us this, the question is, what about gentrification trends and the properties picked for rehabilitation? Do we see that there might be some correlation between the areas being redeveloped and the movement of wealthy people in these areas, maybe even preceding this
Yeah,
development?
so what you mentioned is like it's that's correct. So we worry about that. So we actually look at the income of these new home buyers, and it actually doesn't change after the rehabilitation. So what that shows you, and I'm going to show you the result actually at the end when we're looking at the channels. If I remember correctly, the income of the new home buyers is less than 2% higher than the previous owners, right? So this is based on HOMDA data that we can actually match to these rehabilitations. I'm going to show you that at the end, but we definitely have to do more in that regard, and it's definitely in our to-do list.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. So let me get a sip of water. Okay, so in terms of where are these rehabilitations occurring, right? Here we focus on this neighboring risk score, which is a measure of risk of foreclosure, abandonment of homes in a census tract. It's basically a combination of vacancy rates, unemployment rates, house price drops, the amount of risky mortgages, right, that are being originated in the area. That's how they come up with this index, and the idea is to try to capture those areas that are more likely to experience waves of foreclosures. Okay, so definitely what we see is that the tracks where the rehabilitations are occurring are the ones with the highest risk scores, right? So when you compare them to the rest of the population, right, that's what we find. Okay. We also show in the paper, well, we haven't circulated the paper yet, but we have one written, and we hope after this seminar, actually in a week or two, start circulating the paper. We also show there that the rehabilitations, right, and in particular are not the nonprofit that gave us the data, operates in census tracts with higher predicted foreclosures, higher fractions of high cost mortgages, where home vacancy rates and unemployments are higher, and also areas with recent house price drops, right? So everything is indeed consistent with the mission of these nonprofits, right? That they want to target these neighborhoods that are indeed at risk. So one thing that we're going to worry about is actually to control as best as we can for these local house price trends. Now, this is an issue that affects any paper trying to estimate this type of spillover effects, right? So here we're not innovating in the sense that we're just borrowing the same methodology as papers such as Campbell, Giglio, and Patak, right? Annenberg and Kunt, who have looked at foreclosure spillovers. And we have also the innovation, right, of implementing this new methodology developed by Diamond and McQuaid 2019. Okay, so I'm going to go back and discuss how the methods address for these issues once I explain the empirical methodology. This is so that you guys can see the geographic dispersion that we have in the data. So we have almost 7,000 rehabilitated properties in the sample, and areas that are more active are Florida, California, Georgia, which is where nonprofit is based off, and there's some activity also here in the Midwest. Okay, but overall we have like good geographic variation, which is nice because there's different economic and house price trends occurring across these different areas. Okay? So this is a description of the rehabilitated properties. So as you can see here, these are not expensive properties, right? They tend to be sold through NCST at a little bit more than $70,000, right? The median time from the transfer to the beginning of the rehabilitation is 17 days, right? The median rehab cost is 35,000. The median rehabilitation duration is 70 days, right? So a little bit more than 2 months. And then the median resale price is a little bit over $146,000. This is essentially plotting prices of neighboring properties as a function of distance to the rehabilitated property before and after the rehabilitation. Okay, so what we see here is first is that post-rehabilitation prices seem to be higher, right? That basically reflects the general increase in house prices during our sample period, right, from 2008 to 2017. But the interesting thing is that the difference between before and after, right, it's significantly larger, right, the closer the neighboring property is to the rehabilitated property. Okay, so you have a $60,000 difference here, right? Just on those houses that are basically adjacent to the rehabilitated property, right? And after 0.8 miles, roughly, you see that $60,000 difference decreases to $10,000. Okay, so if anything, this doesn't control, obviously, for local house price trends and other important controls, right? But kind of shows you the headline result and where we're going, that there seems to be a jump in prices of those neighboring properties that are located very close to the rehabilitated property. And if there's any effect, that's going to fade away very, very quickly after 0.1 miles. Okay. So that's a description of the data. Let me now go directly towards answering the question, do property rehabilitations affect nearby property prices? And I'm going to show you two main methodologies here. So first, I'm going to start with the ring method. This is the method that it's the standard in the foreclosure spillover literature. It has also been used in the crime literature, but it has the advantage that first, it's very simple, and second, for us, also provides us with a useful benchmark, because as one of the attendees mentioned earlier, right? One thing that we're going to try to do is to compare the magnitudes that we get with the foreclosure spillover effect in order to gauge first whether the results make sense, right? But also the relative importance of the two effects, okay? So how does this work? So here the triangle, right, denotes the rehabilitated property. So what we're going to be doing is comparing house price changes, right, of properties that are located within 0.1 miles from this rehabilitated property, and we're going to compare them with houses that are located in an outer circle that goes from 0.1 miles from the rehabilitated property to 0.33 miles. Now, these numbers, we don't pick them at our discretion, right? These are the numbers that have been used in the literature. Now, one thing that we thought with Rohan when we were looking at this that was pretty interesting is that if you recall this figure, right, like after 0.1 miles, roughly, like you don't see any change, right? So the cutoff fits naturally, right, the evidence that we found in the description. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing. So essentially, we're going to be running this regression. So this is the log of the prices, right, of these neighboring properties. This is a census tract times quarter fixed effects, which is going to allow us to control for time varying local house price trends, right, and other economic shocks more generally. Now, we're going to define these different dummies. This close, right, is the dummy that takes a value of 1 if the neighboring property is within 0.1 miles of the rehabilitated property. Far is the dummy that takes the value of 1 if the neighboring property is within 0.1 miles and 0.33 miles of the rehabilitated property. Post is an indicator that basically denotes the post-rehabilitation period. One thing that is important to clarify here, for the main analysis, we're going to drop and toss out this 70-day rehabilitation window. We're going to incorporate it into the analysis once we look at the underlying channels. Now that decision doesn't drive the main results, right? But we thought it was cleaner to do it that way. So ultimately what these variables are doing, right, like the interaction is what matters to us, right? The interaction between close and post. So this has a very similar flavor to differences in which you compare the house price changes of the inner and outer circles before and after the rehabilitation. Now, close is the dummy close is important, right? Because it's going to allow you to control for house price trends in the inner circle relative to the outer circle pre-rehabilitation, right? Then we also have this far and this far times post, which are useful because they control for trends in the outer circle relative to the rest of the census tract, right? So there's houses outside actually this circle too that we're going to be using. And remember, we have census tract quarter fixed effects, right? And that allows us to control for those differences in price trends before and after the rehabilitation. We're also going to include this vector of controls, right, which basically include property level attributes, right, and variables such as that are inherited to the neighborhood. So we want to control for things such as the number of foreclosures in the neighborhood. That means in both circles, right, before and after the rehabilitation, right? We want to control for the number of transactions to get a sense of the liquidity and the market activity, right? And we also control for the number of rehabilitations that are occurring using the whole data set of rehabilitations, because when in the paper we have the details, but there's some sample selection criteria based on availability of data, right, that forces us to drop some of the rehabilitation. So we use those still to control for the potential rehabilitation activity and getting to one of the concerns that you guys already raised. And the other thing that we're going to control for is that within this program, right, 80% of the properties are purchased from banks, but about 20% of them are donations. So we're going to have a donation dummy to control for that. Now, if you toss out the donations, if you think there's anything funny going on there, that doesn't change the results, but we decide to keep them because it increases the power of the tests more generally. Okay, so that's what we're going to be using first, this ring method approach. Now, in terms of describing the neighboring transactions, right here you have basically these neighboring transactions that are close, and here you have the ones that are far, right? We see that indeed the sales price, right, prices tend to be lower for those houses that are close to the foreclosed property, which is actually consistent with the fact that there is a foreclosure negative spillover effect, right? And the fact that foreclosures tend to occur in neighborhoods that are deteriorating, okay? The rest of the variables seem to be more similar. So before I show you the results of the regressions, let me visually show you the result. So this still is not the same as the regression, but it's pretty easy to observe things visually, right? So this is the house price, right? House prices of properties that are close to the rehabilitation before and after, right? So the rehabilitation period is denoted by this line, but remember there's like a 70-day, like on median value, right? Separation between these two lines, right? So you see a sharp increase, right, in house prices. This is an increase of about 12%. Whereas if you look at the properties that are further away, that is further than 0.1 miles or 2 blocks from the rehabilitated property, there's just an increase in house price trend, but there's no jump, right, after the rehabilitation, right? So this kind of summarizes the headline result, and you can think of the empirical methodology basically comparing this jump with this jump, right? Kind of like in a difference in difference setting. Okay, so this is the headline result using this ring method. Essentially, here we're controlling for, like I mentioned before, census tract, fixed effects. This is a dummy that controls for whether the house was a donation or not. We have property controls. This is using data from Silo, right? Number of bathrooms, square footage, age, square terms of those variables, right? A complete set of controls for the property characteristics. And then we have these two sets of neighborhood controls. The ones that I flag here, or that I denote by 1, those are the foreclosure counts and the transaction counts. So we only count arm length transactions, obviously. 6 months before and 6 months after the rehabilitation. And then in this last specification, right, in column 4, we also add the control for the amount of rehabilitation activity 6 months before and 6 months after, right, close to the rehabilitated property. Okay, so in the most saturated regression gives us an increase of 4 percentage points in house prices. Okay.
Gonzalo, can I actually ask a few questions that we have here in the chat? So may I interpret the positive effects as mitigating the negative price effects of foreclosures on neighbors? Or do you mean that the size of the price increases is larger than the negative price effects without rehabilitation?
So can you repeat? Sorry, can you repeat the question?
So could the results that we see, the positive price effects of the rehabs, mitigating the negative price effects of foreclosures on neighbors? Do you mean that, or do you mean that the size of the price increases because of rehabilitation is larger than the negative price effects without rehabilitation?
So I think it's partly mitigating the result, the spillover effect of the foreclosure. I'm going to show you some cross-sectional analysis comparing areas with high rates of foreclosures with areas with low foreclosures. I'm not saying that the foreclosure spillover effect is not there, right? But to the extent that we find a positive effect, right, and that there are foreclosures in some of these neighborhoods where these are occurring, yeah, I think it's fair to say that we're that these rehabilitations are offsetting some of those spillover effects. Okay, now I'm going to show you that the spillover effects, as you would expect, are going to be stronger in those areas where you have low rates of foreclosures. Now, the effect is still going to be positive, though more modest, right, in areas with high levels of foreclosures. Okay?
Okay. All right, so one metric in evaluating local house prices should be the mean price of local community. Since the rehabilitation drastically increased the mean price locally, the flipped house should be the bottom outlier. Wouldn't it be natural that the neighborhood prices go up?
I think it's not exactly, I don't think it's obvious that it should go up, right? I think the real question is the magnitude, right? You could tell a story that, okay, one house is not going to make a definite effect, right, in a whole neighborhood. I think that's why you actually find these effects being confined to the 1-2 block distance, right? This is how local these effects are operating, right? So I'm not claiming that you do one rehabilitation and you change the whole face of the community, right? I'm just saying that, I'm just arguing that we have, and I'm going to show you the next method. Actually, I think it's a very good method to actually identify these spillover effects, and that we're finding a positive spillover effect, right? Now, the question is the magnitude, right? So the magnitude here is very important, and this goes back to the original question that asked how this compares to the foreclosure effect. We're not going to find an effect that is, once you adjust for differences in the settings, we're not suggesting that the rehabilitation effect is as large as the total foreclosure effect, but it's positive and varies in the cross-section according with the intensity of the rehabilitation, the duration, which is also consistent with the saliency channel. So ultimately what we have in mind in the end, and just to give you a preview of the underlying channel section, we have this idea in our minds of this hedonic preference, right, that you may have to live in houses, right, where that they look nicer, right? Your neighbors may be better neighbors, right? There's something going on, right? That generates value for neighbors, right? After these properties get rehabilitated. We're not going to get at things such as, okay, maybe you can think there's a peer effect, right? Like the fact that there's one house that gets rehabilitated incentivizes other neighbors to improve the house, right? We're not going to take a stance in those with that level of detail, just to give you a preview. But I think those are the things that are going on. But these are very local effects of like within 1 or 2 blocks, right?
Okay, I think there's, if you can go back to your figure that you're shown for the, the price effects, there's a question that the script jump in prices exactly at T0 is disconcerting. The rehab is a continuous process and price negotiations, house sales take days or more likely weeks. Do you have some idea why the jump is so
Yeah, so
discrete?
to be clear, I should have mentioned this more than once actually. This is a median duration of 70 days, right? So what we're dropping here, right, is the whole rehabilitation period. So essentially, this red line basically stops once the house is like basically once the house gets transferred, right, from NCST, from the bank to NCST, then the rehabilitation starts, right? Then we're not plotting prices until the house is sold later. Okay, so we're basically taking or I think, or once the rehabilitation is it's completed. I forget the detail there, but essentially this is a long time, right? This is on the median duration, right? 70 days, right? So we're not saying that okay, this rehabilitation occurs, right, and house prices jump immediately. Actually, when I split this effect in different periods, and that's what I'm going to show you at the end. Basically, you don't see any effect before the transfer. You don't see any effect within once the house gets transferred, but the rehabilitation hasn't started yet. You start seeing an effect during the rehabilitation, and that explains roughly 50 to 60% of the jump. And then you see an increase after that once the house gets sold, right? So it's not an immediate jump. So yeah, that's a good point. I should have been clear about that. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So so this goes back to one of the questions. Okay, economic significance, right? So let me first give you a sense of how we're thinking about this rehabilitation. So we have this increase of 4 percentage points on neighboring properties that are within 0.1 miles or 2 blocks, right, of this rehabilitated property, right, relative to properties that are further away. That's essentially if you take the median house price, right, and you multiply that by 4%, that gives you a little bit less than $5,000, right? So essentially we're saying there's an increase or spillover effect of about $5,000, right? Which if you divide by the median size of the rehabilitation, that gives you a return or a spillover effect on the investment, right, of about 13 cents per dollar spent. Okay, so again, these are very local effects, right? So this affecting only a few houses, right, that are around 1 to 2 blocks to the rehabilitated property. Now, how does this compare to the foreclosures, which was the initial question? So there's two main differences between our setting and the setting of foreclosures, or at least these papers by Campbell, Giglio, and Patak, and Annenberg and Kuhn, more generally. So the first thing, and specifically here I'm comparing with Campbell et al. The first thing is that the median property rehabilitation investment is almost twice as large than the loss in value for the foreclosed properties. So the foreclosure discount documented in Campbell et al. Is around 26%, whereas the average rehabilitation investment in our sample is close to 50%. So it's almost twice as large, right, in terms of how much value is invested versus how much value is lost in the foreclosure. The second thing is that our rehabilitation time takes 70 days. That's the median value, right? Whereas the foreclosure effect estimated in these other papers it's a 1 year effect. So the effect of foreclosures happens through a longer time period. So once you adjust for those differences, actually you find that our effect is something around 0.4 percentage points once you scale it to make it comparable to the Campbell et al. Paper. And the effect in Campbell et al. Is 1 percentage point, right? So we're essentially finding an effect of rehabilitations, which is roughly 40% of the foreclosure effect. Now, the interesting thing is that when you think about this foreclosure spillover effect, you can roughly think of two components, right? So you have the disseminated effect component, which is more related to the concept of rehabilitating house. And then you have the fire sale component, right, which has to do with the urgency in which these houses that are foreclosed are sold, right? And Annenberg and Kuhn actually have a paper in which they estimate the fire sale component of these foreclosures, and they find it's 0.6 percentage points. So if you, of course, not a comparable apples to apples across papers, right? But if you take the 1 percentage point from the Campbell et al. At face value, and then you take this 0.6 percentage point effect in Annenberg and Kuhn, then the remainder, right, is a 0.4 percentage points that would be related to the disseminated effect, and that's roughly what we're finding once we adjust for the differences in the settings. So essentially, I'm not trying to also claim, and I want to be cautious here, that okay, the rehabilitations basically offset the effect, the disseminated effect of foreclosure completely. But my point here is that our results are within expected ranges, right? There's nothing that in terms of the magnitudes that kind of like raises a flag, or at least we thought a lot about how to reconcile the numbers and how to think about them, and I think they're pretty much in line with the ones found in the foreclosure literature. Okay. So yeah, so this is what I just mentioned actually. So, oh, sorry. So also, like within this ring method approach, we run a ton of robustness. So we run different subsamples based on how we select the areas, right? We include narrower time varying geographic fixed effects of census block times year times quarter, right? Also broader fixed effects, right? And importantly, at the county level, and also importantly, we also have some specifications that include property buyer fixed effects. So essentially, they control for the type of nonprofit that is facilitating the rehabilitation, just in case you worry that maybe some nonprofits basically are better at selecting these properties, and that might be driving some of the results. But the thing is that it doesn't. The results are pretty much stable across all these specifications and remain very close to the 4 percentage points that I showed you in the previous table. Okay, now one last regression that we run within this setting is we replace this closed dummy with a variable that takes continuous values, right, of the distance, right, within 0.1 miles, right? And why we do that is because it allows us to find whether there's a differential effect, right, in the effect of the effect of rehabilitations that varies with the distance to the rehabilitated property, right? So that's what we find. So basically, this is consistent with this table is consistent with that result. The closer you are to the rehabilitated property, the stronger the price spillover effect that we find. Okay, but I don't want to spend too much time on that because I don't have too much time. I want to go through this second approach that we developed, which I think is a nice addition to the paper. So we complement the previous analysis using this new non-parametric method developed by Diamond and McQuaid. It has two main advantages. The first one is that it allows to better accounting for potential very local confounding house price trends. So essentially the intuition of this method, I'm going to give it to you in a second, but it's very helpful with that. The second thing is that although I show you that this 0-1 miles cutoff, right, pretty much like fits nicely with the descriptive stats figure that I showed you initially, right? This method actually avoids the arbitrariness associated with the selection of the radius for the inner and the outer circle, right? So this is, you can think of this method actually as being like the continuous version of the ring method if you want to think about the intuition. So essentially how this works is that, and I'm not going to go into the details because that would take too much time, but you can check the Diamond and McQuaid. It's a very nice paper actually, and they explain the method very clearly there. Not only in terms of the implementation, but also the intuition behind it. So essentially what they do is they express a log of house prices, right, around, in our case, the rehabilitated property using polar coordinates, right? So essentially everything's going to be expressed as a function of the distance to the rehabilitated property, but also the direction from the rehabilitated property. And the price function is going to have different sub-functions, some of which are going to allow you to control for different price trends, right, in different directions from the property, and one specific function that is going to be related to the spillover effect, right? So then the objective is that you numerically can estimate the partial derivative of house prices, right, to the distance from the neighboring property to the rehabilitated property, right? Then you need to do some smoothing, right, using kernel regressions to kind of like smooth these derivative estimates, right? And then you end by integrating everything across distance and time, and that allows you to generate the smooth surface of house prices, right, as a function of distance and time, right? So you'll see the plots are very easy to interpret, and they're very nice in terms of looking at how these spillover effects are operating. So, and one nice addition also that this method provides is that it allows estimating the derivative of house prices at a given distance from this rehabilitated property. So there's theory that actually links that derivative to the willingness to pay to live closer to the rehabilitated property. So that's one of the things that we're going to show you in terms of an estimation for that marginal willingness to pay. Okay, so this is what the method ultimately generates, this nice surface, right, of house prices. And what does this show you? First, look, like this is the pre-period. I can show you a zoom actually of this, and look at the scale, right? So these pre-period trends are pretty much flat, right? So there's no variation in house prices before the rehabilitation as a function of distance and time from the rehabilitation, right? So that's a nice addition, because you saw that with the ring method, there was somewhat of a trend, right? A negative price trend that the areas closer to the rehabilitated property were experiencing. Now, we kind of control for that using the dummies, right, and in the ring method, right, but it's not as granular of a control as in here. And in fact, the confirmation is that we don't find like a pre-trend, right, once we apply this method, so which shows that we're controlling for that more successfully. The second thing is that once you're very close, right, if you're adjacent to the, which is here, right, this is the distance from the NCST property that is being rehabilitated. If you're adjacent to that property, you see a jump of more than 2 percentage points uh, in the neighboring property prices after the property rehabilitation occurs. Again, here we're dropping the rehabilitation period, right? So this is after all the process until the rehabilitation finishes, right? Now the difference of in levels, right, with these 4 percentage points that I show you with the ring method and this method is that you cannot compare them apples to apples, right? In the sense that actually the baseline estimate for this method, everything's being estimated at a 1 year horizon, right? So that's kind of like the benchmark, houses 1 year from now. But you can see two things from this figure. So the first is you have the jump. Second, the jump in house prices, right, decreases as you get further away from the rehabilitated property, right? And the other interesting thing is that the effect is pretty much persistent. So you don't have a reversal, right, once you look at least 1 year after the rehabilitation, right? I don't think we have looked beyond the 1 year. But those are the findings here, which confirm the existence of this spillover effect. Now, you can also collapse this figure, right? You can integrate it in a way that you remove the time component, right? And you just get you just can worry about the distance, right? This is the 2.3 percentage point increase, right, in prices, right, for those properties that are like very close to the property. Now the rehabilitated property, sorry. So the nice thing about this, about collapsing this, is that allows you to gauge statistical significance. So here we see first the effect monotonically decreases, right, as you get further away from the rehabilitated property. And in particular, you lose statistical significance at traditional levels after 0.1 miles, right? So all these results are so pretty much consistent with how the ring method has been used traditionally, right? You still have 10% significance of the effect, 0.15 miles, but then you cannot distinguish the effect once you go further, right? So again, this confirms the same thing that we confirmed with the ring method, that these are very local effects operating within 0.1 miles, which, to give you the context, is a distance of 2 blocks, typically, from the rehabilitated property. Now, this is essentially the plot that corresponds to this table, right? If you want to see the whole support, right, of distances. Consistent with the decrease in prices as you get further away from the rehabilitated property, you also have a negative derivative, right? And if you focus on the derivative 0.1 miles, right, that allows you with some additions in the calculations, and I'm not going to go into the details, you can actually estimate the marginal willingness to pay close to this rehabilitated property, and we estimate based on our sample variable values that that's roughly $4,000, right? So that's kind of like the added benefit for the representative household, right, from living close to these houses that are being rehabilitated. Okay, so now let me switch towards cross-sectional effects. So I think the first two methods establish that there's a spillover effect. Now the focus here is to see where it's more prevalent. And so I'm going to be looking at different dimensions such as the amount of intensity, right? So the amounts invested in rehabilitation, how long it takes, and then I'm also going to be looking at neighborhood characteristics. So I'm going to basically split the sample based on the number of foreclosures that you observe in the neighborhood and the number of transactions. Okay, and we're going to be applying the Diamond and McQuaid method to this subsample. So everything's, by the way, everything's going to be split by these variables, right? And I'm going to take the upper and lower terciles, and that's what I'm going to plot, okay? So this is, for example, the price spillover estimation of these rehabilitations for these properties that are in the upper tercile of invested amounts in the rehabilitation. This is the lower tercile. So we don't see an effect actually when the rehabilitation is modest. And I should remember the number of like the amount invested here, but I was going to check it and I forgot. So I don't have it in the top of my head. So maybe Rohan can add it to the chat. Um, but these investments are significantly lower than the ones that you have here. And here you have roughly the same shape for the house price surface that I showed you earlier. It's just that the jump, right, it's a little bit higher, right? It's not 2.3 anymore. It's 4 point something. Okay, but the general finding remains within this sample, right? You have a larger spillover effect. It decreases with the distance to the rehabilitated property, and it's pretty much constant 1 year out from the rehabilitation. Okay, then very quickly we can see the same pattern, right? Once you split the sample based on rehabilitation duration. Interestingly, rehabilitation duration doesn't correlate that highly with rehabilitation intensity. The correlation between the two variables is 0.2, right? Which tells you these two variables are capturing different dimensions of the rehabilitation. But we find roughly the same result that we find for rehabilitation intensity. Then we split the sample based on which type of neighborhood the property rehabilitated is located, right? So basically this is splitting based on the number of foreclosures. So those areas with more foreclosures are here on the left, and the areas with lower numbers of foreclosures are here on the right. The effect, the price spillover effect, is stronger for those areas where you have less foreclosures, but interestingly, it's still positive, right? And like maybe 1.5 percentage points, I forget the precise number, but in that order, right? On those areas, even in those areas with high foreclosure activity. And the pattern seems to be always the same, right? The spillover effect decreases with the distance to the rehabilitated property, and it's pretty much constant and persistent through the 1 year period following the rehabilitation. Okay, and a similar result we find when you look at liquidity. Those areas that where you have more liquidity is where you find the largest rehabilitation effect. So let me now go, how much do I have? I have like 3 minutes, right?
Gonzalo, you have about 10 minutes easily. So
30
that
minutes?
we've started 5 minutes late, and we have, going to 2:15 anyway.
Okay,
I,
great.
I
So
have a quick question regarding your results, because it seems like rehabilitation works in the neighborhoods which are structurally sound in some way. So if you do have this neighborhood is not really having much of a problem, not too much over, you know, foreclosures, then that's when the rehabilitations are having the biggest impact. If you do have neighborhoods which are really beaten down and it requires a lot of work, then it's probably is going to be of a less successful policy intervention.
So okay, so that on the in the cross section, I think it's true. But now remember that, as I showed earlier, NCST, right, operates already in areas that are highly distressed, right? So I don't remember the number in the top of my head, but even these areas, you would think, compared to the average population, right, they're pretty much distressed. So going back to the plot that I showed you initially based on this HAD risk score, right? Remember that most of the rehabilitations are occurring in those areas that have in the highest I think was in the highest quintile of HAD distressed risk score, right? So what you say is true. In the cross section, I think in areas where you have less foreclosures, like you have smaller effects. Now here you have a bunch of foreclosure effects that are pushing in the other direction. Now we should be controlling for that. So yeah, I guess you're right. But even in these areas, right, I would argue there are significant distressed homes here in these areas, right? And even here you find a positive effect, which shows you that even in those areas with more foreclosure, you still get some benefit of conducting the rehabilitations.
All right.
But that's a fair point, and we're still thinking about those issues more generally. Um, Okay, so in terms of underlying mechanisms, so we're going to be looking at the rehabilitation spillover effect during various stages of the rehabilitated property. So what do I mean here is I'm going to split the period around the rehabilitation into 5. So the first period is going to be the 6-month period before the property is sold for rehabilitation, right? Because before the transfer through NCST. Then the second period is going to be that between the property sale, right, once the house gets transferred to the nonprofit, right, and the start of the property rehabilitation. Then the third period is going to be the period of the rehabilitation. The fourth period is going to be that after the end of the rehabilitation and before the property is resold in the market. And then the fifth period is going to be the 3-month period after the rehabilitated property is resold on the market. And we're trying to look at this spillover effect using the ring method in this case, which you can basically what you do is you run interactions of this variable close, right, with these different dummies that capture each one of these periods, right? That allows you to capture the spillover effect in each one of these different periods, which is something that you cannot actually do, or at least we couldn't figure out. And I think it's because you cannot do it within the Diamond and McQuaid framework. So here I'm going back to using the ring method again. Okay, so this is what we find. So essentially, here you have the effect of close, right, relative to far, right, at different points in time, right? Here, this is for essentially peace of mind, right? This is in those areas in the outer circle, right? There's nothing going on, right, in the outer circle, which is consistent with the plots and the results of the regressions I showed you earlier. So let's focus on this left panel. So the positive rehabilitation spillover effect starts emerging right during the rehabilitation period. And then it increases a little bit more after. Now, why I think this is relevant? We think this is relevant because first, if the effects of rehabilitation were operating only through the reduction of the supply of foreclosures, right? Because maybe you prevent the damaging foreclosure of the property itself, right? You should see some effect during this period, right? During period 2 in particular, right? So that's inconsistent. This result is inconsistent with the results being merely driven by a reduction in foreclosures. Now, the fact that you have some effect here, right, it's also inconsistent with the effect of rehabilitations operating through appraisals, right? So you would think of the effect operating through comparables, right? Once you rehabilitate a property and that gets traded at a higher price, maybe it becomes the comparable for some other transaction that is going on, and because of the increase of the price, you're increasing the ultimate valuation of the neighboring property. Well, if that's the effect, you shouldn't be observing an effect during the rehabilitation period. And here's where we find that roughly 60 to 65, I think, percent of the effect it's coming from. So, and we interpret this effect during the rehabilitation as probably being explained by the salience of the rehabilitation, right? The fact that you can see that there's this house that is being improved and it's getting these nice additions and nice new features. So that's what we try to inspect and examine next. So I mentioned this earlier, that we have access to these work orders that are very detailed and tell you exactly in what the different amount, the total amount of the rehabilitation investment was spent. Okay, so you can see, for example, this is the same work order of the associated to the example that I showed you earlier, which was a house in Pontiac, Michigan. So you can see the different expenses, right? So essentially what we do is we basically search in these documents, right, for variables that are linked to expenditures that you would think are external and that people can see. So things such as changing the roof, right? Working on the landscape, right? Fixing the driveway, right? Painting the house on that side, right? Those type of things, right? So essentially we try to classify the rehabilitations on whether the rehabilitation was mostly uh, external or internal, right? And importantly, we develop a measure and then we orthoanalyze it to the duration of the rehabilitation and the total expenditure in the rehabilitation. So we're kind of controlling for those two variables, right, when we do the comparison. Okay, and then we do the same thing. Once we identify this saliency with this new variable that we construct based of these work orders, then we split the sample in terciles and we repeat the cross-sectional surfaces that I showed you earlier. And we find that the effects are indeed stronger for those properties where you see that the repairs are more salient. Now, importantly, like I mentioned before, this is controlling for, in some way, for the amount invested in the rehabilitation and the duration of the rehabilitation. Okay. So we interpret this result also as support that the saliency seems to be important. Then there's one more thing, more result that I'm going to show you. This actually was generated last night, so literally fresh from the oven. Basically here, what we do is using Honda, we match we match the transactions to Honda. If I remember correctly, and Rohan can correct me on this, I think we match something like 70% of our samples. So this doesn't use our sample or complete sample, but you can match a fairly high amount of the neighboring transactions with Honda using loan amounts, lenders, and census tracts. Okay, but yes, but basically the main takeaway here is you compare the income of those buyers right before the rehabilitation with the income of those buyers after the rehabilitation, and you can do this within the Diamond and McWade setting, and we find an increase of a little bit less than the 0.2%. For some reason I thought it was higher. So it's a very small increase in income, right? When you think about, because one of the concerns that we had was what was brought before on gentrification, right? Maybe it is the case that the buyers that are coming in are actually wealthier, right, and of higher income, right? And maybe that's part of what's explaining these effects, but we don't find that. And this is more generally consistent with the fact of this example that I showed you earlier, right? The new income buyer had an income that the new home buyer had an income that was lower than or was 80% of the median or the average median income of the area, right? So generally these nonprofits are actually focusing on trying to bring buyers that are of lower income as opposed to buyers that have more financial means. So that was one concern, but once we found this result, it kind of fits with the narrative that you get from these nonprofits. Okay, so now in this issue of the underlying mechanism, this is something that we really need to work more on, and basically this is a work in progress, and what our focus on the next few weeks is going to be. The other thing, given that I have a few minutes, that I want to mention is we're also looking at the characteristics of the census tracts where these spillover effects are occurring in terms of percentage of minority income of people that are more generally, but we didn't have time. Those are running as we speak, so we didn't have time to add them to the presentation. So let me conclude. So we find that actually distressed property rehabilitations generate important spillover effects on neighboring property prices. So, and this effect is stronger the closer the property is to this property being rehabilitated. The effects are stronger for longer rehabilitations, greater rehabilitation investments. So the more you invest on them, and importantly, they're prevalent even in areas with high rates of foreclosures. So far, we find evidence that mostly indicates that rehabilitations operate through their salience and not through a reduction in the supply of distressed properties or through property appraisals. But we haven't been able to pin down things such as, okay, maybe neighbors also start rehabbing houses to keep up, right? Okay, maybe these new buyers, right, although they don't have higher income, they still are valuable neighbors, right, that increase the value of the properties. Or maybe people just like to look at nice houses across the street, right? So, but all our results are consistent with any of those two. But in general, we interpret our results consistent with this greater hedonic preference for living closer to these higher quality properties. And overall, our results also suggest that investing in property rehabilitations can be a useful tool to stabilize these housing markets that are going through distress in the sense of experiencing house price drops or foreclosures more generally. Okay, so that concludes the talk. So if there's no questions, that's all what I have to say.
Thank you very much, Gonzalo, for a very interesting presentation. Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
to our audience for all the questions that we had. We had a lively seminar today. Before I let you go, let me tell you that next week we're going to have Francesco Franzoni from Swiss Finance Institute Lugano, who is going to talk about competition for attention in the ETF space. In the meantime, again, if you would like to follow with Gonzalo and Rohan after the presentation, please reach out to them by email. They are going to receive the full transcript, so they're going to see who asked the question, and they may still follow up with you if there's any additional clarification. So thank you very much again, and have a
Thanks,
wonderful rest of
everyone.
the day.
Thank you.